Welcome to another episode of InRange. I'm coming to you today with an Old West vignette from Lincoln, New Mexico. Another episode about the Lincoln County War. So I need to explain the Lincoln County War for this video because it is a standalone video. And if you already know about the Lincoln County War, you still might learn some stuff about it. And there are other videos on the channel about Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. But behind me, you see the Tunstall store, still standing to this day, built in 1877. The Tunstall store was the headquarters of a cattle operation between Alexander McSween and John Tunstall, an Englishman. Alexander was traveling through Santa Fe, New Mexico for legal reasons. He was an attorney and a lawyer. Met John Tunstall and they became friends and worked together as a joint operation to form a cattle ranch right here. So territorial New Mexico was essentially a very corrupt place. It was run mostly by something called the Santa Fe Ring. The Santa Fe Ring was an amalgamation of both government officials and corporate interests, and by working together they attempted to control all financial interests within what they could, the majority of New Mexico. And the Murphy-Dolan cattle ranching operation, referred to as the House here in Lincoln, was part of the Santa Fe Ring. So John Tunstall and Alex McSween, coming together to essentially compete right here at the Tunstall store with the House, knew what they were coming up against. This is the view from the balcony of the House, the headquarters of the Murphy-Dolan cattle ranching operation. You can see how it towers over the rest of Lincoln, and was built obviously to provide an example of the opulence and success of the Murphy-Dolan cattle operation, but it also sort of was an unstated statement. Look at our power, look what we control, look at us. So John Tunstall and Alex McSween were not naive. They knew they were going directly against the corruption of the Santa Fe Ring, and here in Lincoln that was the guise of the House, the Murphy-Dolan cattle ranching operation. So they went around the community and hired a number of ranch hands and gun hands to protect not only their interests, but them directly. One of them infamously being Billy the Kid. In another instance of a husband not listening to his wife, Susan McSween said to Alex, "This is crazy. You're going to get yourself murdered." And she was right. That's the grave of Alex McSween right there. We're going to get to that later in this video. However, in February of 1878, while John Tunstall was riding back into town, some of his gun hands rode forward for a little bit of just enjoyable pleasure, and they got too far away from him, and a posse of assassins gunned him down in cold blood. And that right there is John Tunstall's grave. So after the murder of John Tunstall, Billy the Kid, amongst others, were deputized and provided warrants for the arrest of the people that were suspected in the assassination of their friend. They were then called the Regulators. Alex McSween took his wife and family out of Lincoln to defend them because he didn't think that they would be safe here in the town. However, the Regulators kind of didn't issue those warrants by paper. They issued them by bullet and started killing the people that they suspected killed their friend John Tunstall. This ultimately escalated into a direct outright war and conflict called the Lincoln County War. So multiple battles ensued right after this, with McSween and his family safely out of Lincoln. However, in July of 1878, there were actually a few convictions of some of the corrupted officials associated with the Santa Fe Ring. And at that point, Alex decided that he was going to make his stand, bring his family and the Regulators back into Lincoln proper. On July 14th of 1878, Alex McSween, his wife, her sister, 5 children, and about 40 men came back into Lincoln and took defensive positions throughout the entire town. They, of course, dominated and took over the McSween home, but other homes throughout the community that were friendly to the Regulators and the McSween cause and the fight against the corruption of the Santa Fe Ring. However, this turned out to be the most epic battle of the war. On July 15th, only one day later, Sheriff Peppin sends a man with a warrant to the McSween house. He doesn't get to the house because a firefight ensues, and this really begins the battle in earnest. Only one day after McSween returned to Lincoln. However, at this point, the Regulators had already taken up defensive positions throughout the town, and as a result, it really wasn't possible for Peppin and the Murphy men to get an upper hand. At this point, he sends an emissary to Fort Stanton and asks for assistance from the military to help deal with the issue of the Regulators and these, quote, outlaws. At that point, the Lieutenant Colonel Dudley of Fort Stanton states that he cannot do so because of posse comitatus. At the same time, a couple families start wandering into Fort Stanton asking for protection for them to do something about this war zone that used to be their community. He says again that he cannot offer anything as regards to that because of posse comitatus, but does provide a safe place for these families at Fort Stanton. That said, he does send one Buffalo soldier into town to try and do an investigation and see what's actually going on here in Lincoln. So on July 16th, Lieutenant Colonel Dudley sends in Private Robinson, a black soldier, a Buffalo soldier of the U.S. Army, here into Lincoln to investigate. Upon arriving in Lincoln, Private Robinson reports that he received fire from regulator positions on the McSween house. Whether or not that fire came from the regulators or not, we cannot verify. However, they stated they did not fire at him. He was not able to complete his investigation because of that fire. On that same day, Sheriff Peppin and the Murphy Dolan men, set up snipers on the hills behind Lincoln. This provides them an elevated position to provide fire down not only into the McSween house, but the Montano house just east of town. So the town of Lincoln is actually sort of in a canyon. There's hills both on the south and the north side. And both the regulators and Peppin and Murphy's men took positions on both sides, trying to get the high ground to achieve fire supremacy over the other. Behind me is the Montano store, which is on the east end of town, and this position was held by the regulators. Fernando Herrera, one of the regulators, saw one of Peppin's/Murphy's men on a hill on the north side, 900 yards away, and he decided to try and take a shot at him with his buffalo rifle. He carefully took aim through one of the windows or firing ports on here and fired a shot. Lo and behold, that shot hit the hammer of the man's rifle and then went up and through him and knocked him to the ground. A fatal wound indeed. In fact, he died later that day. It was an amazing shot from Fernando Herrera, 900 yards across this canyon with a buffalo rifle on one of the continued days of this 5-day siege. So this is the view from the Montano store and the view that Fernando Herrera, the regulator, would have had at the hills where he took that 900-yard shot on one of Peppin's men and successfully made it. You can see that's quite a ways away. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and the reality is that was quite a shot. So I'm standing at what was the camping location of Lieutenant Colonel Dudley and his military operation right here. There's a modern house behind me, but that wasn't here at the time. This was just an open area near the Rio Benito. On July 19th, after 4 days of sieging the McSween house, Lieutenant Colonel Dudley brought his military operation in here to defend the women and children. So at around noon, they marched through Lincoln, coming in from the west over here to the east. As they came through, they actually came to meet Peppin himself and told him that they were here to defend the women and children and not to take sides. However, on their way through, they only spoke to Peppin and Murphy's men. They did not speak to the regulators. Upon getting here, they set up camp. They brought a Gatling gun with them and a howitzer and 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Those were then ultimately aimed at the McSween house just west of here as an intimidation factor. Now, under the rules of posse comitatus, he knew that they couldn't fire a shot. So what he did is just use these weapons as intimidation, and that will come in as a tactical advantage later in the battle. However, as they were marching through the town, the regulators knew that they couldn't fire a shot, and this caused a ceasefire because they absolutely could not be perceived as firing at military men. While this ceasefire happened, it actually turned the tide of the battle. Because of this ceasefire, Peppin and the Murphy men were able to take reinforced positions around the McSween house and get closer to them, and because of that, they lost their tide or their inertia in the fight 4 days into this battle. At this point, the battle rages back on, worse than ever in the last 4 days. At this point, Susan McSween, the wife of Alex McSween, decides to take matters into her own hand. She actually crawls out of the house under fire, literally evading bullets, gets to a relatively safe position, stands up and comes to here, and demands to speak to the commanding officer. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley comes out and asks what he can do for her. And she says, "I thought you were here to protect the women and children of Lincoln." And he says, "I am, but if you're going to house people like Billy the Kid in your home, you don't deserve my defense. And besides, if your husband wishes to burn down his own home, what is it my problem?" At that point, she goes, "My husband doesn't intend to burn down our home." And he says, "Oh, but I have a letter to prove otherwise." Goes into his tent, comes out with a piece of paper, and reads to her this letter in which supposedly Alexander McSween intended to burn down and incinerate his own home. And then he turns it over and says, "You can recognize the handwriting." And she says, "Let me see that." And when she goes to reach for it, he pulls it away and says, "You may not have this. You might tear it up. And if you try to reach for it again, one of my soldiers will shoot you dead here on the spot." At that point, there's an apocryphal story of her supposedly slapping Lieutenant Colonel Dudley. I'm not sure that actually happened, but she did come out here and face him directly. Realizing that she was not going to get any support from the military and that they were really in cahoots with the Santa Fe Ring, the Murphy, Dolan, and Peppin clan, she went back to the house, crawled back in under fire, and came to report back to the regulators and her husband that the military was absolutely not there to help them. In fact, was there to assist the opposition. And at that point, they knew they were doomed. So right behind me, your screen right, where that sign is where the McSween house used to stand. It was a very large U-shaped adobe. The northwest corner was a kitchen, and the northeast corner was a kitchen. And that's, of course, where McSween, his wife, the Regulators, her sister, and 5 kids were holding up in this battle now for essentially 5 days. At around 2 p.m., Lieutenant Colonel Dudley turned his howitzer up towards the hills behind the house, because up in the hills the Regulators had positioned men providing fire supremacy and protection to the rear of the house to make sure no one could get too close. By pointing the howitzer up at that position, the men that were providing that fire supremacy had to displace because they didn't know if they were actually going to fire the howitzer. What they did is provided an opening in an unprotected area at the northwest corner of the McSween home, at which point one of Peppin's men approached carefully and set the house on fire. The northwest corner kitchen started burning and the fire could not be put out. This was at 2 p.m. on July 19th. So behind me is where the McSween home used to stand. Behind me to your left is where the fire was started at 2 p.m., the kitchen. To the right is the northeast corner, and that's where the fire slowly burned through for 7 hours. During those 7 hours, the battle out here escalated to the point where over 2,000 rounds were fired over those 7 hours, back and forth between Murphy and Peppin's men and the Regulators. According to the reports, the military never actually fired a shot. However, they were more than willing to turn the Gatling guns towards Regulator positions as well as the howitzers to get them to displace. Quite an act of intimidation without quite violating posse comitatus. Well, as this fire raged on, the Regulators and the family slowly moved through the home, attempting to evade the smoke, the acrid smoke and the burning flames and the heat. They moved room to room, firing in and out. At 5 p.m., at this point, Susan McSween, her sister, and her 5 children were allowed to leave the building. They left. The Regulators and Alex McSween remained in the home, continuing the battle, ultimately landing up in the northeast corner of what was the other kitchen of the home. At around 9 p.m., it became unsustainable. This was the last room, and it was burning. They had to make a decision. Alex McSween apparently lost his mind and said, "I've lost it. I don't know what to do anymore." And at this point, Billy the Kid sort of took over command, and he said, "We're going to break out." He devised a plan. What they were going to do is they were essentially just going to suddenly break out of the home and head north into the Rio Benito, and that was going to be their escape path. They were going to do this by providing suppressive fire on the run. They were going to do it in 2 groups of 4, essentially. There was going to be 4 men that were going to break out and then another 4. The problem was it really wasn't under the cover of darkness anymore. It was stated that the burning McSween home was so bright that the entire town of Lincoln looked like it was lit by daylight. So around at 9 p.m., Billy lit a cigar literally off the burning walls of the McSween house, put it in his mouth, loaded his guns, and they made a run for it. He was not the first one out the door, one of the few in the rear. The first few men out of the door actually took fire. Billy ran and jumped over one of the dead bodies while firing both of his pistols, nearly hitting a few of the Peppin's men. Him and a few others of the Regulators made it to the Rio Benito. Alex McSween and the others were the second group to break out, and they were running right behind me, essentially where those fences are. And unfortunately, they took a fusillade of fire. Alex McSween was hit multiple times, died in his own backyard, and was left there for days with chickens picking at his body and his eyes. So the story really doesn't end here. Now, one could argue that the Lincoln County War ended here because this was the last true battle. But for Billy the Kid and the Regulators, they were now on the run, and a number of gunfights and escapes were to ensue. Some of those videos are here on the channel and more to come. But where this story really doesn't end is with Susan McSween. Susan left Lincoln for quite a while, got remarried, got divorced, that didn't work out, came back to Lincoln, sold her holdings that she had with her now deceased husband, and bought 40 head of cattle. She turned that 40 head of cattle into 8,000 head of cattle, formed the Three Rivers Company, and became one of the largest cattle ranches in the Southwest. She became a prominent cattle baroness and became rich, and lived here in White Oaks, New Mexico. You can see by the prominence of the home behind me that this was quite an opulent place in its day. White Oaks is now in decline. It's essentially a ghost town, but it is a monument to the buildings that you see around here of how powerful and rich it once was. It's really amazing to me that in this story, that the only victor in all of this was the wife of Alexander McSween. When she told him, "You're going to get murdered doing this," he was murdered. And then she ultimately turned it around after this battle and the slow decay of the power of the Santa Fe Ring, and turned herself into a cattle baroness and a powerful woman of the West. Susan McSween passed away on January 3rd, 1931 at the age of 85 after living a truly epic life of the West. As she got old, she needed to sell the ranch and decided to try to live off of those proceeds, but she either lived a little longer than she expected or the proceeds burned out a little faster than she intended, and she ended up having to go into town and sell jewelry and baubles from the past when she ran out of money just to sustain herself. Luckily, she had some friends and she made it to the age of 85. She's buried here somewhere in the Cedar Vale Cemetery, just outside of White Oak. Not a prominent monument here, which is a shame because truly, when you think of the story of the Lincoln County War, Billy the Kid, and all those countless names that are essentially blazed into the American history, the reality is Susan McSween should be blazed into it just as much as Billy the Kid, if not more so, considering all the things she accomplished. InRange is a Patreon-supported project. There are no sponsors, no corporates, no overlords, no media mogul telling us what we can do or what kind of content we can create. And it's really because of you Patreons out there that we can do this kind of content. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you already are one, thank you. If you'd like to consider it, you can find us at patreon.com/InRangeTV. If you can't, I do understand. Just subscribe to one of our multiple distribution points. We're not just on YouTube. You can find that at inrange.tv/watch. But even more importantly, share with your friends. Thanks for watching.